Well, howdy, folks. Saw you coming in off of that Durango mighty fast. Why don't you take a load off of that Mustang and help yourself to a sarsaparilla. I'm building a stable this week. Hi folks, welcome to Glitter Void Gamecraft. My name is Eric, and this week we're finishing up some of the outbuildings and the farm with these. The barn/stable and a plot of planted land. This week was a learning experience. And like most learning experiences, I'm glad it happened, and what I learned going forward is going to make everything that I build on this channel that much better. But I'm glad it's over. I can only take so much learning at a time. But this stable in particular is going to be a super versatile piece of terrain. More uses than just a farm by far. More ideas on ways to use it at the table later in the video. For now, let's get building. My plan for the barn was never going to be a traditional barn. That's just not a very interesting building, either to build or to play inside of. I decided to create two sections, an interior with some stable-like pens for the horses, and then an exterior that had sort of a wagon bay. I imagine this would be like a parking thing for the wagon. I decided to go with a lean-to style for the roof because I thought that would be more interesting. It would be, but not in the ways that I would expect. The field segment was going to be about 8 square inches with a fence around it, and wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do for crops, if anything. I felt like keeping the field without anything actually grown in it would make the piece more universal, but also more boring, so we'll see how I feel when I get there. The field had been covered in drywall joint compound and the fence built both exactly the same as the animal pen in the animal pen video. Not wanting our potentially fallow fields to be devoid of anything interesting, I decided to create some, I don't exactly know what you call them, but basically stakes with a string between them that you would train a vine to crawl up for, like these were grapes, or some kind of creeping plant. I cut some toothpicks to a reasonable length and then wrapped thread around them to create the twine, wire, whatever it was between the poles. After demonstrating my complete lack of ability to tie decent knots, I decided to just wrap the thread around each pole and hit it with a dot of super glue. The thread actually absorbs it really well and bonds excellently. I didn't really have exact measurements on any of this. I just kind of eyeballed what felt like a good distance between them and tried to keep it less than the space inside of each fence. For the support beams on all the corners of the stable structure, I used inch-thick XPS foam. I cut the sections much too long since I wasn't quite sure how I was going to attach the roof at the moment, so I wanted to make sure I had some extra to work with. Each beam was approximately ½ inch square and maybe 8 inches long. I created an exaggerated wood grain texture in all of the pieces using the lead of a mechanical pencil. I did it on the full length even though I knew these were going to be trimmed short. The walls were made out of the ever-reliable dollar store foam core board. Here I'm demonstrating both a excess and a lack of thinking. I cut out each of the walls for the lower section that I was imagining was going to be separated from the roof, but I wasn't thinking about the total sizes that I was going to need. These 6 identical pieces had the same footprint, but I ended up realizing that the end pieces needed to be longer to accommodate for the roof, and then the back pieces needed to be longer to meet the peak of the roof, and so when it all came down to it, I used one of the 6 small pieces. I made the door to the stable segment much larger since the idea would be you were either walking or riding horses into this segment. And then I did what I keep telling myself I'm going to do and actually carve the door into the material rather than cutting it out and adding it later. One thing to remember when doing something like this is to create a even greater distinction between the edges of the door here and the individual planks because you have 3 sizes of texture. The wood grain, the planks, and then the separation between the doors and the rest of the building. planking and wood grain texture was added to the walls here. And just when you think it's done, you gotta flip it over and do the same thing on the inside. I cut a hole in the side wall of the stable just to create a large window. Figure this sort of thing, they need lots of ventilation. Also, don't forget to add wood texture to any revealed surfaces. Since I wanted a loft both for practical and just tactical elevation purposes, I cut a hole in the center wall between the wagon bay and the stable itself. I imagined that the wagons would pull into the bay and then unload some of their hay or whatever for the horses up through this window. I was slightly limited as the angle of the roof and size of everything was such that I couldn't make the door too big. I laid out some of the pieces to get an idea of the footprint that this was going to have so I could then cut out a base piece for it. Leaving myself a little bit of room for error, I had a footprint of 6 by 10.5 inches. Like with the other structures, I used the good stuff, the crafting foam from a Michael's or a big box store. And I actually had this piece that was nearly the exact size that I needed. Once I double checked that all the pieces fit with enough room to cut in the slope between the base and the table, it was time to start gluing things together. For this I chose just a tacky glue. It's basically regular white PVA glue with less water in it, so it's just stickier. And I pinned everything since between the edges and the thick plank texture, there were lots of places for me to hide the pins. Now normally I don't worry too much about keeping structures square as I just attach it to the base, but with this I was attaching the walls to the posts and the posts were definitely not square, so I just put some heavy bottles of whatever I had lying around to try to line them up while the glue dried. I didn't really take any measurements for the loft insert. I just kind of eyeballed something and then cut out notches to accommodate the interior of the posts. I would initially leave this long on the far side as I wasn't going to attach the wall, but as things progressed, everything was just so flimsy that I had to attach it together. I used some leftover corner support beams to create a central pillar for what would become the insert with the dividing wall and the doors to each of the stables. This would be left out and painted separately from everything else. The roof substructure was just cut out of regular dollar store foam core. For the covering of the roof, I opted to go for cereal box cardboard slats rather than shingles. I cut them about 1/2 inch wide, letting the blade go wavy on one side just to create a more hand-hewn look. This roof caused me all kinds of troubles. Since I wanted it to overhang, I wasn't going to be able to leave the front set of support beams with a flat surface. I'd have to cut them at an angle, but that means there would be nothing to stop the roof from sliding forward. So I would have to create something to prop up or wedge the roof in place so that it wouldn't slide off, but I would only have one side to do that since there was no wall on the wagon bay area. I cut off the corners using the angle of the side walls as a jig and did the same to the top of the wall so that the roof could lay flat. Fortunately, the roof being made almost entirely out of cardboard and foam core, it was very light, which meant that this well-cut piece, that's the width of the stable segment, was able to hold it up by itself. I just attached it using hot glue and stuck it in, making sure to remove the building while drying so nothing got stuck to it. The roof slats were arranged with an overlapping pattern with the wavy side down, since the other side would be hidden, but I really should have made them a little bit wider so that once they overlapped, you would have more than a little fragment of each one showing. I used tacky glue to attach them and then sliced in some wood grain texture with my X-Acto knife. This would pick up dry brushing really well. I also made sure that any of the visible edges of the substructure had a wood grain texture. Since the pieces were too long, I arranged them so that one side was about where I wanted them and then just trimmed the other one. Another mistake I made with the roof was leaving the slats as long as they were. I went back with a mechanical pencil and basically gouged out plank lines to make the roof more interesting. This kind of worked, but it also got a bit lost in the paint. What I really should have done is trimmed the slats as I added them. The outside of the building was looking a little dull, so I created a door frame for the front door and a window frame for the giant window on the side. Since I imagined that the barn owner wanted this to be secure but also not as stinky, I created what looked like a prop openable window. I cut the connection point at an angle so that the propped open section of the window wouldn't be perfectly level with the ground. I felt like that made it look like something that you could open when it was hot and smelly in the stables, but then close at night when you wanted things to be secure. This was also attached with tacky glue, and I created a little prop open dowel rod thing that I wedged in under the window. I thought that the little window up to the loft needed like a crane or a winch kind of a thing, so I created some kind of armature that would attach over the top of it that you could imagine a block and tackle or rope or something was set up to help haul things up into the loft. I tried a different design for the door pulls. I used a regular square of chipboard and then a small piece of cereal box cardboard to kind of create like a leather loop or something that would attach. I soaked the whole thing in super glue so none of this would move. Everything was still looking pretty neat, so I went all over and just started chopping away little bits to make everything look a little bit more worn, not forgetting to add wood grain texture to any new surfaces that you create. Back to the base, I took my knife and angled it to cut a more natural shape along the edge as the transition between the table and the higher level of the actual building. Something not completely unexpected was that all that tacky glue caused a little bit of warping on the roof. Since it's caused by something like glue drying and contracting, you can sometimes counteract this with more glue on the other side, hoping that it bends the other way. This helped a little bit, but I did have to actually apply some brute force and physically bend it back into place. Just take it slow and it should be fine. I had pretty much the same trouble with the field tile and solved it with the same combination of more glue and bending. Something else that could have been avoided by some more planning is the gap between the top of the back walls and the roof. I decided to just extend with another small section. Not wanting to fight the same battle with this section of roof, I actually weighted it down while the roof slats dried. I also immediately forgot my lesson and had to draw in the slats as well. This was attached using hot glue right at the peak, no need for any cutting of fancy angles. And now that this wasn't actually a lean-to, I created a roof cap using the cereal box cardboard, and scoring the center, I introduced a gentle curve to create that L shape necessary. This was attached using hot glue. Some of the unintended benefits of this was both that it counterbalanced the rest of the roof so it didn't slide off as easily, as well as basically acting as a hook at the top of the wall. I did have to create some little gap fillers using extra pieces of the support beams. I glued these into the roof right where the highest poles touched. Everything got the usual base coat of Mod Podge mixed with black craft paint. I often will wet my brush to help the Mod Podge flow a little better and get into some of the cracks in the detail. The base for the stable got a coat of black craft paint by itself since the ground cover was going to seal this pretty well. The field got a base coat of the black craft paint as well. I went ahead and put some wax paper down before I did the Mod Podge on the fence, as with all the little crevices and bits, this was going to be really messy. Since 90% of this project is wood, I decided to get creative with some of my color choices. The roof and the fence for the field were going to get the usual old wood look, but for the rest of it, I wanted to go with something a little more of an orangey red. I just mixed red and yellow in with regular old brown. I brushed this onto all of the wood of the stables, being lighter on the general planks and going heavier on the beams themselves. I figured that once I hit it with washes, they would look somewhat different. The door stoppers were, of course, mostly metal, though I also went in with some brown to hit the little leather straps. This kind of detail work can be pretty tricky if you mostly paint terrain, but it's good practice for if you ever decide to get into minis. For the redwood highlights, I just mixed the same color but with a little more yellow and less brown and red to just kind of create more of a yellow-orange highlight. Time for the signature black wash. I just put this on literally every surface. The door poles also got a coat of wash. To bring all the colors together, I did a light dry brush on everything with suede. Something you can do to help imply a light source is to do a heavier dry brush on the sort of upward facing parts. With the paint job done, I could now install the interior divider support segment. Since I wanted the tilled part of the field to look different than the rest, I painted the edges in a brown so that I wouldn't have to cover them with the ground covering as well. I mixed up brown and black craft paint with about equal parts PVA glue and a huge amount of sand. Seriously, I'm always surprised how much it takes to get this to a good consistency. Glorping it onto the field and spreading it out, I quickly realized I needed more and had to whip up a second batch. That all looking sufficiently mucky, I installed the fence using white PVA glue, as well as plenty of pins, hiding any of the pinprick holes in the texture. Installing the poles and wires was a real trial by error process. I actually don't really have any good footage of it because it wasn't literally until the last set that I got a good method down. Basically, I ended up using a pin to poke a hole, gluing it in place with tacky glue, and then any excess string I just wrapped up around the pole before hitting it with some super glue so it would stay in place. Then I attached all the door knockers with super glue. And now for my next mistake. The plan was to mark out where the posts were going to land, and then using a pin and some glue, install some toothpick ends to stake everything in place. The ground would be covered with the mixture of PVA glue, paint, and sand, and I figured what would happen is when I would push everything together, the mixture would glorp out of the way and then also act as glue for the undersides. I mixed up a huge batch of this stuff and glorped it all over everything. Fortunately, this stuff has a very long working time, so I was able to get it all over everything before squishing the base down. Moment of truth, I got everything in place, added some glue to the undersides, and then started pushing everything down. This immediately failed as the mixture would not gloop out of the way and kept the posts from actually staking down. I tried pinning it, but the pins were not nearly strong enough. So this whole thing sitting about 1/8 of an inch up off the base, I had to go back in with some extra mixture and basically build up a foundation underneath everything. The ground cover dried excellently, and I love the way it ended up looking, and I was even able to go back in and add some wagon marks into the bay. A quick dry brush here and there with some browns added some variation to the mud and made some of it look a little bit drier. I stained the poles and the cord between them with a brown wash, this having the awesome effect of making it virtually invisible to camera. It looks pretty good in person though. I continued painting across the surface with different mixtures and shades of brown. When painting natural materials like this, you really can't have too many different colors as long as they're kind of in the same family. It'll just add to the realism and ease transitions and make things look better. And then it was outside to put some clear coat on everything. It was Halloween when I filmed this. While installing some tufts of grass, I decided that the field looked a little boring, so I tried to create some vines. I tried one method using sand on a string, and that wouldn't stick. I found some moss that I had bought, but as I pulled it apart, it turned out that it wasn't really stable.
There wasn't really enough surface for everything to stick, so I ended up abandoning this. For some color variation, I decided to try my hand at creating some flowers. I took the tufts of store-bought grass, and getting a big gloop of paint on my brush, I just kind of tapped and teased some of the tips together. I tried to get 2 or 3 little strands together, hoping that when this dried it would look something like flowers. I was pretty proud of this. I just wish I had chosen a color that wasn't in the same family as everything that I had already painted. These were installed here and there around the stable, just breaking things up from the sea of brown. Not wanting to waste any of the moss that I'd broken up, I created a vine just by covering the surfaces with glue and pressing it together. With more surface to stick on, this worked very well. And voila! A stable and field. Especially the stable here is a very versatile piece of terrain that you can use in all kinds of things. Just like the rest of the farm buildings, they are completely mobile and modular since they are not on the same base. Put them together in any configuration you wish. Now you can do whatever you want with the field terrain in terms of what is and isn't growing in it, but this one I decided to do it this way because I thought it made it kind of tactically interesting. The aisles of the field can break up movement, and you could consider it difficult terrain to move between one aisle and the other, or even making it impossible, forcing enemies to run around and forcing players to take that into consideration when moving. I'm really proud of the sort of unintended versatility of this piece. This started out as a barn, but really it's more of a stable, and you could work it into virtually any building. Put it next to a tavern and it's just the stable for the tavern. Or make it a building by itself and it's a place for the heroes to lodge their horses. And it's also a great place to get ambushed in. Multiple entrances and exits to the stable segment make for very interesting combat and ways for players to get in and out of the building. They return to the stable to get their mounts, having received whatever information they needed from the mysterious quest giver, only to find the mounts missing or dead and various enemies there to ambush them. Or maybe they're the ones messing with other people's mounts or lying in wait for whoever is trying to make off in the night. Maybe this is actually something of a loading dock and the heroes are lying in wait to jump down or sneak down in the cargo to a waiting wagon being whisked away to the fortress of evil Lord What's-His-Face.
So there you have it. Warps and all. Because it was warped a little bit. I hope that some of the mistakes that I made in this build are going to be ones that you can learn from and not make when you're making your own terrain. This sort of concludes the mini-series within the main series of kind of the outer buildings of the village. And next we're going to be moving into the village, so stay tuned for that. Let me know in the comments below what you thought about this, and if you liked it, consider giving it a thumbs up or subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.